Welcome to this, the latest of a series of lectures this year in our History of Capitalism course, which is devoted to the history of various cities that have exerted powerful influence in that capitalist history. And it's all the cities that we're dealing with in the course of this year, from the city in California through to the city in Istanbul and Turkey, and the cities of central Germany and the Hanseatic League that David Avellefia talked about right at the very beginning of this year. Few have been as important and had as profound an influence, not only economically but also politically, culturally and socially, as the city of Manchester. And one of the very distinguished daughters of, shall I call Oldham part of Greater Manchester, really?
Oldham.
Well, there we are.
I can't deny it's my hometown.
No.
Not quite Manchester, but as close as you might get.
Yeah, well, one of Oldham's very greatest daughters is with us this evening, Victoria Bateman. Victoria, who's been and is a great adornment to the History of Capitalism course ever since she came here 2 years ago now this spring, Victoria.
That's right.
The first year of the course when she delivered a sparkling lecture on the history of the later Middle Ages and the impact of the Black Death on labour rates, and how the Black Death was very good news for female labour because it boosted up their rates of pay and their income. Cottonopolis, this great commodity, is going to be the subject of Victoria's talk this evening. She is a great person for the big sweep, the big dimension, and she knows how to relate the big sweep and the big dimension to particular moments in time that grab our attention. So her story is going to be partly autobiographical at the very beginning, and then is going to take us up on a great chariot-like sweep through a recorded time of 2 centuries, right up to perhaps 1980s and 90s clubbing in the Manchester scene. Who knows?
Didn't
Ladies and
experience
gentlemen.
much of that myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's always a privilege to be speaking here at the Legatum Institute, and thank you for coming along this evening. In the words of the great historian Eric Hobsbawm, whoever says industrial revolution says cotton, and, we might add, whoever says cotton says Manchester. Whilst Manchester is perhaps best known internationally for its football, and admittedly, as a child, my parents dressed me in red rather than baby pink, it's the Industrial Revolution for which the city truly deserves fame. Described by one tourist guide from 1807 as an immense manufacturing, mercantile and trading town, and by another at the end of the 19th century as the chief industrial town of England and the great metropolis of the cotton manufacture, it should be clear that this is a truly capitalist city. Now, Manchester, which lies at the heart of the cold and damp north of England, was at the centre of a global economy of cotton, importing raw material to produce cotton cloth that was exported to customers right across the world. By the end of the 19th century, British cotton manufacturers were exporting 80% of all of the cotton products that they were producing. And British cotton exports alone accounted for 3/4 of all the world's cotton exports. Now, pictured here is the very building that earned Manchester the title Cottonopolis. Perhaps it's the most important building in the city because it's actually the centre of market exchange in the cotton industry. It's the Royal Exchange building, and this is where all of the cotton deals were made to send cotton products out to customers right across the world. Now, this is actually the first of a new series of Royal Exchange buildings in Manchester, built in the 19th century. So here, this one is depicted in 1817. The building itself dates to 1809. And here's a later version, a much bigger version. You will see that these buildings become bigger and bigger over time as the cotton industry is expanding. So this is the Royal Exchange now in 1860. You can see the classical style of the building. And what's more interesting perhaps is the interior. So this is where all of that market exchange, all of those deals were being struck. So this is the interior of the Royal Exchange in 1880. Already a very big building, this goes under further extension. And by the early 20th century, it actually forms the largest trading hall in the whole of England. Now, my grandparents and their grandparents before them all earned a living as workers, as cotton workers in Manchester's cotton factories, in mills such as this one here, Arkwright's Mill, and this one here in Ancoats, depicted more recently in the late 20th century. So growing up in the 1980s, I was bombarded by stories of an age that was by then rapidly vanishing. As my grandparents' hearing stood testament, cotton mills were noisy places, in response to which cotton mill workers developed their own sign language so they could communicate with each other during the working day. Now, that working day was long and traditionally at least started at a young age, at an age of 8 or 9 in the 19th century. It's therefore of little surprise that the idea of my staying on at school after the age of 16 was viewed as an exceptional luxury by my grandparents. After all, the younger you started work, the sooner you got on the mill workers' ladder. Now, while some cotton mills were still in action whilst I was at school, including one that I visited as part of my GCSE Business Studies project, it was clear that they were living on borrowed time, desperately holding on for survival. Industrialisation and cotton manufacture were spreading to countries in which labour costs were significantly lower, leaving many of the mills in which my family had once worked falling silent. In some ways, you could say that history was coming full circle. It's certainly true to say that cloth production had begun outside of Britain, in places like India, and after a 200-year respite in the north of England, perhaps you could say it was simply heading back home. Now, once the factory doors had firmly closed, a number of my relatives moved to work at the other end of the cloth trade, on the production floors or in the design studios of expanding British fashion labels or couture houses that could still afford British wages. Britain's early industrialisation was clear in every aspect of my early life, just as it is in the fashion-conscious and stylishly dressed Britain of today. It's just as evident in the upmarket fashion labels of Bond Street here in London, the city in which I now live, as it is in Manchester itself. From Vivienne Westwood and Betty Jackson through to young fashion designers such as Jenna Young, the North's historic strength in the production of cloth has cast a long but very welcome shadow. And whilst the Germans might be known for their cars and chemicals, we Brits certainly know how to dress. And whilst as a feminist, I sometimes feel that I'm not really supposed to be interested in fashion, I also know that my Mancunian heritage lets me off the hook. Now, why Britain was home to the first industrial revolution, which we must remember was an event that marked the start of modern economic growth and brought with it ever-increasing prosperity over the last 200 years, is the holy grail of economic history. And it's a question that we will help to answer in this lecture by looking at what Manchester can teach us. As we'll see, this Cottonopolis displays both the best and the worst of what capitalism has to offer. And whilst in more recent times the city has seen its fair share of suffering, it's now turning this suffering into success, channeling social movements and radical politics into a vibrant art scene. Economic change necessarily brings political and social change, and it's by embracing it rather than resisting it that the city has continued to thrive. Now, while cities are, of course, nothing new, in the case of Western Europe, and looking across the long span of time, they are, in fact, relatively recent. The first city emerged around 8,000 years ago in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, following the Neolithic revolution in agriculture. Over time, cities sprouted up throughout the Middle East, also in the Indus Valley, in modern-day India and Pakistan, and in China. However, rural life was still the norm, and cities didn't start to expand in size until around 1500 BC. At that time, Thebes was home to more than 100,000 people. By the time we reach 100 AD, however, the backwater that had been Europe was now heading centre stage, and Rome had a population of somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million inhabitants, a megacity. Now, whilst it's certainly not true to say that nothing much happened in the centuries that followed the decline of the Roman Empire, what did happen was perhaps pale in comparison to the effects of the Industrial Revolution that began in the second half of the 18th century in Great Britain. It's then that the next major chapter of urban development begins. However, as urbanisation spread in Europe, urbanisation in these early civilizations in the Middle East and in China was moving in the opposite direction. Recent research by Zhu, van Leuven and van Zanden finds that in the early 13th century Yangtze Delta, 23% of the population lived in cities, and that's in cities with more than 10,000 inhabitants. So roughly 1 in 4 people in the Yangtze Delta already living in cities in the early 13th century. By 1776, that figure had dropped to 15%. Now, across the same period, urbanisation rates in Europe were expanding. And this means that whilst China was still ahead in about 1200 AD, by 1800 the tables had very much turned, and Britain was now leading the way. Now, rather than being rooted in state power, the newly emerging European cities were built on market exchange. In comparing Europe with the old cities of the Middle East, Bosca et al. In recent research have concluded as follows. The urban system that arose in Western Europe between 900 and 1300 was geared towards generating its own resources via market exchange. It was highly competitive, independent of large territorial states, and became oriented towards long-distance trade via the sea. It was this new dynamic, more state-independent urban system that generated the long-term economic development that was characteristic of Western Europe in the millennium after 900, and which finally, spurred on by the impact of the great discoveries, made Europe overtake the Arab world in terms of economic prosperity. And research says similarly when comparing Europe with China. Now, initially, Britain was a bit of a backwater compared with other parts of Europe. So here we have urbanisation rates in a number of European countries. The heavy blue line is showing Britain's progress over this time, and you can see that she's going from the bottom of the league table to heading the league table by the 19th century. So between 1500 and 1850, England's position was transformed from one of the least urban economies to the most urbanised part of Europe, with around 4 in 10 people living in towns or cities, double the European average by 1850. And ever since Britain's urban and industrial expansion, urbanisation has been on the rise across the globe. In 1800, only 3% of the world's population lived in urban areas. Today it's 1 in 2, and predictions suggest that by 2100, further than is shown there on that table, 85% of the global population will live in towns and cities. Hence, while cities have always existed going back 8,000 years, it's only relatively recently, and following in the footsteps of British cities like Manchester, that they've become a regular feature of all of our lives. So having looked at the history of city development, I now want to zoom in to the case of Manchester to ask why Manchester and why cotton? Now, we've said that market-based foundations were central to the emergence and expansion of European cities. In the case of Britain, markets combined with technological developments to push forward the urban frontier in the 18th and 19th century, taking the country to the top of the urban league table, as we've seen, through the development of cities like Manchester. Now, since cities need to be fed, our natural starting point in any story of city growth must actually be outside of the city, in the fields of farmers, rather than in the factories of industrialists. A productive agricultural sector has always been crucial to support the development of cities, just as it was with the emergence of the world's first city 8,000 years ago, following the Neolithic revolution in agriculture. However, in an increasingly global world, agricultural progress actually risks deindustrialization, as it can turn an economy into a breadbasket supplying food to countries across the world. So when it comes to the relationship between agriculture and cities, it's quite a difficult balancing act. Now, fortunately for Britain, whilst the country was becoming an efficient food producer, it was also becoming a super efficient producer of industrial goods in the 18th and 19th century. In economist language, whilst Britain was developing an absolute advantage in both farming and in industry, it had a comparative advantage in industry, and this narrowly saved Britain from becoming that breadbasket of Europe. In the case of the cotton industry, technological developments in spinning and weaving, pioneered by the famous names like Hargreaves, Arkwright, Crompton, and Cartwright, were responsible for that increasing productivity. And you don't need me to tell you all about them. You can find their portraits on display at the National Portrait Gallery, not far from here. Now, initially, the new machinery was powered by water, meaning that cotton factories had to be located on fast-flowing and reliable rivers. However, following Arkwright's application of the coal-powered steam engine to powering one of his factories, water supply no longer was a limitation. As a result, cotton factories sprouted up across the Lancashire region, within and surrounding Manchester. And the Bridgewater Canal, completed in 1761, sometimes referred to as the Duke's Canal, helped to transport coal cheaply to the city's cotton factories to fire those steam engines. Now, fundamental to Manchester's success was the stick of competition. Competition between producers ensured that the new machines diffused quickly between producers, and that as they diffused, that filtered through to lower prices for consumers. So any initial profit that came from a new machine was quickly eroded by competition with other producers, to the benefit of customers through lower prices at home and abroad. As Tim Loynick of the London School of Economics has shown in his research work, this competitive pressure helps to account for the super productivity of Lancashire firms compared with those that developed later in, for example, New England in the US. Now, by developing its transport infrastructure, Manchester made sure that as the prices of its cotton goods fell, its products could make their way out to customers across the world, attracted by those ever-low prices. Transport developments included a railway connection to Liverpool, the nearest port, opened in 1830, and later the Manchester Ship Canal, completed in 1894. There it is. Interestingly, the Ship Canal is another example of competition at work. It was actually pioneered by industrialists in order to try and break Liverpool's monopoly as a port, to divert trade straight into Manchester itself without having to go via Liverpool. Industrialists believed that they were paying too high dock charges in Liverpool. In response, Manchester actually became Britain's third largest port, despite being 40 miles inland, though this did breed a friendly but healthy rivalry between Liverpool and Manchester. Now, in my last lecture for the History of Capitalism series, I noted the fundamental importance of female labour to the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. I argued that the decisions made by the everyday woman about work and family were just as important as the work of the industrialists and engineers celebrated in the bronze statues that grace our big industrial cities. It's therefore of interest to note that 58% of cotton factory workers were female in 1833. So this was a female-dominant sector of the economy. And women accounted for almost 10% of business owners in Manchester as early as 1788. Might not seem that impressive, but it's not that far off figures for the modern day. So in some ways, Manchester was ahead of its time. I should also note that the northern religious movement, known as Methodism, involved a number of female preachers from its very early days. And whilst it's long been suggested that whilst young unmarried women work, that married women withdrew from the labour force, evidence actually suggests the opposite in the case of Manchester. Evidence from midwives interviewed by the Factory Commission Inquiry of 1833 suggests that not only did women regularly labour in the factories until the actual day that they gave birth, but that they returned to work within a month of doing so. According to the census for 1861, over a half of Stockport mothers with children under the age of 1 worked, along with 2/3 of women with children under 5. They only withdrew from the workforce as their children became older and could help to support themselves financially. But whilst women were engaging in opportunities outside of the home, not everyone was keen. In his report to the Factory Commission Inquiry, Dr. Hawkins noted in 1833 that, to quote, "Manchester's married women fall remarkably short of the usual characteristics of the English wife. She has had no time, no means, no opportunities of learning the common duties of domestic life. And even if she had acquired the knowledge, she has still no time to practice them due to her long day in the factory." So with the foundations of female labour, together with the resistance from certain quarters, it's perhaps of no surprise that the women of Manchester were central to the women's movement, to the suffrage movement, campaigning for equality between men and women at the ballot box. Manchester women were well used to having their voice heard and using it. My own family has been matriarchal for as long as I can remember. It's just a shame then that of the 17 statues in central Manchester, only one of them is of a woman, and you can probably guess who that is, Queen Victoria. Quite fittingly, Emmeline Pankhurst will soon be joining Queen Victoria after a local campaign to bring greater recognition to the historic role of women in the city. Now, with the success brought by both the male inventors and transport engineers, of which we're more familiar, and the female workers, the army of female workers, by 1831, the cotton industry alone accounted for a half of Britain's merchandise exports and 22% of the country's industrial value added. In addition, and with a total factor productivity growth rate, we can think of that as being technological growth, total factor productivity growth rate between 1780 and 1860 of 2.6% per annum. We'd very happily accept that today in our snuggish recovery from the financial crisis. With that very successful productivity growth, the industry accounted for a quarter of the economy's total factor productivity growth. In 1800, Britain was home to 95% of the world's cotton spindles, and even by 1900, with the rise of foreign competition, it still was home to 58%, so the majority. And the majority of these spindles were located in Greater Manchester and the surrounding region. In 1850, 66% of them were in Lancashire, and actually that was increasing with time to 79% by the turn of the century. So this was a heavily concentrated industry in and around Manchester. And that concentration led to what economists of the New Geography School refer to as economies of agglomeration, external economies of scale that arise from firms in the same industry being located close together. That allows them to benefit from deep, specialised, experienced labour markets, from suitable suppliers of raw materials and machinery, from which they can source at lower cost, and from technological spillovers between firms. Now, despite Manchester's success and what might seem a clear and visible role of market forces combined with individual ingenuity, the story of the Industrial Revolution has recently been retold. Firstly, as one in which the British state is made responsible, and secondly, as one whose success should be attributed not to domestic forces, but to foreign influence. And it's time now to wrestle with each of these twin challenges. So the first, did the market or did the state drive growth in the Industrial Revolution? Of course, as far as Marx and Engels were concerned, Manchester was capitalism in action. However, authors such as Ha-Jun Chang have suggested that Britain's industrial success was in large part due to the state's interfering hand, including through tariff protection. In his popular book, Kicking Away the Ladder, Chang makes the argument that having themselves become successful on the back of tariff protection, rich countries are now denying poor countries in the world the same opportunity for growth. However, whilst the tentacles of the state certainly cannot be completely dismissed, it's important to note that whilst left-leaning thinkers like to see the state as being the machine of the people, able to solve collective action problems and work to the benefit of the majority, historically speaking, the state has often been on the side of the master rather than the common man, helping to bolster the position of elites by restricting the freedoms of the majority. And in the 19th century, that included by protecting landowners by placing tariffs on agricultural imports on imported food in the form of the Corn Laws, something which increased the price of food for the average worker and, needless to say, the costs facing industrial producers. So to those coming from the bottom or middle ranks of society, state interventions often seem to be working against them rather than in favour of them. And here it's worth noting that the global free trade movement can be said to have begun in Manchester itself, in response to the new industrial class rising up against the then established landowning elite. These laissez-faire industrialists were not living comfortable lives on the backs of the poor, as some might like to make out. They were the new kids on the block, the underdogs challenging the elite, often having come from rags to riches themselves. And here it's worth me mentioning recent research that's found that social mobility in Victorian Britain was actually on a par with that in the 1970s. Now, Manchester's historic fight for free trade was celebrated in the building and naming of one of the city's greatest buildings. Here it is, the Free Trade Hall. And in the words of William Dean Howells, who in 1909 published a tourist guide for Americans visiting Britain, he said of Manchester, "I am not myself so extreme laissez-fairist as to have thought of that school with pathos in the city of its origin. But I dare say it was a good thing in its time. We are only now slowly learning how to apply the opposite social principles in behalf of the man rather than the master, and we have not yet surmounted all the difficulties or dangers of the experiment." Now, in addition to the state-centred challenge presented by writers such as Ha-Jun Chang, the role of the state can also be seen in other more malign ways, in the state's colonial machine and the overseas slave labour from which British industry initially benefited, the infamous triangular trade between Britain, Africa, and America. Whilst the role of slavery in history certainly cannot be denied, as evidence of its human toll began to emerge, Manchester took a leading role in the anti-slavery movement. And support didn't come simply through words. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the blockade of southern Confederate ports in the US prevented the outflow of raw cotton to Britain, and that led to a cotton famine in the Manchester region. Within a year of the war beginning, 60% of Lancashire's cotton machines were out of action due to a lack of raw cotton, and this caused massive job loss and suffering across the region. But despite the immense suffering of the working people, at a meeting in the Free Trade Hall, workers voted against the Royal Navy breaking the blockade on those southern Confederate US ports and decided to go in support of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, leader in the anti-slavery movement, subsequently wrote to the working people of Manchester in 1863 to say, "I know and deeply deplore the sufferings which the working men of Manchester and in all Europe are called to endure in this crisis." A statue now stands in honour of the former president in the very centre of the city of Manchester. So whilst the slave trade might have existed at the beginning of Manchester's cotton industry growth, Manchester nevertheless played an important role in bringing it to an end. Now, the rapid development of Manchester did bring problems that the state needed to enter and address. And this is where the state had a positive as opposed to negative effect, correcting market failures, particularly in the realm of waste and sanitation. The rapid development of Manchester brought in sanitary conditions and squalor. Here's Ancoats. Ancoats in Manchester, and that's actually on a good day. And in response to those insanitary conditions and squalor, diseases spread fast, and a toll was taken on the health of workers. Engels is famous for his emotive words relating to the condition of the working class in England, the title of his book. But you don't have to be a Marxist to acknowledge that there were growing pains associated with the expansion of cities like Manchester, as Lord Shaftesbury, the Conservative politician, and as Edwin Chadwick, the social reformer, demonstrate. More recently, economic historians have turned to data to quantify the impact on human lives in the city. They found that the residents of Manchester lived shorter lives than those born in the countryside. In 1841, life expectancy in Manchester was 25, compared with mid-40s in rural Surrey. Not only did it take a toll on the length of your life, you would witness many more deaths of your children if you lived in Manchester compared with the countryside. And through disease and malnutrition, people were stunted. At my own height of 4'11", hence why I'm stood here before you today on a platform, you can tell I have Manchester genes. Nothing shocked me more going to Cambridge as a student than all the tall people that surrounded me. The first time I left Manchester. Now, the adverse effect on health was not good for the economy, as creativity and productivity were harmed. Try getting a good long day of work done if you're feeling ill and lacking nourishment. Only once the state began to take appropriate action, prodded by social reformers such as Edwin Chadwick, providing clean water supplies, sanitation systems, and public health programs, together with regulating work for child labourers, were the negative effects of economic growth on health successfully counteracted. And once the state did take such action, the nation's health began to improve, and so did the nation's economic growth rate. So here, state interventions really did bring benefits, and estimates suggest that the interventions paid for themselves at least 3 or 4 times over. There are important lessons here for cities developing today, and important contrast to be struck by, for example, looking at Indian cities that have some conditions that I wouldn't say are on a par with Manchester, but getting close, in comparison with Chinese cities where the state has been more active in terms of things like sanitation and waste. So that's the first of the twin challenges to the market-based success story, the role of the state. And there we have denied the type of more excessive role suggested by writers such as Ha-Joon Chang, but at the same time arrived at a more balanced position, the market as the leading force, but the state nevertheless with an important role to play. Now for the second of the twin challenges, the domestic versus external origins of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the global nature of the cotton industry cannot be underplayed and has recently received emphasis in Beckhart's book, Empire of Cotton, and Riello's book, Cotton, the Fabric That Made the Modern World. You could say that the industry was global even before globalization itself. In fact, not only did Manchester sell cotton goods, it also exported the secret to its success, the machinery, which made it ever more productive. So whether you were in Japan, Russia or Turkey, if you wanted to start up your own cotton mill, you could literally order one off the peg from a contact in Manchester. However, recognising the global reach of the cotton industry no longer seems to play to Manchester's advantage. In his book, Riello notes that whilst we have traditionally thought of the north of England as having changed the world, it's time to acknowledge that the world changed the north of England. In other words, in a lecture such as this, rather than me suggesting that the world is standing at Manchester's feet, it's instead me, the Mancunian, that should be thanking the rest of the world, noting that the city stood on the shoulders of giants elsewhere, of developments and discoveries in textiles that happened over many centuries in countries outside of the West. Now, clearly Manchester, and indeed Britain's whole industrial revolution, couldn't have been the success it was had the country or had the city been a hermit. And after all, the whole point of economic trade theory is to show that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, that countries or cities do better by engaging with each other rather than trying to do it alone. However, the dramatic shift we've seen in the historical literature is perhaps going a bit too far in placing emphasis on foreign influence. As Eric Jones has pointed out, ideas and materials have filtered from the East, but that is not the point, even without any allowance for independent European discoveries, such as those of Arkwright. The point is the response. However early in time developments in making cotton had occurred in Asia, and whatever transmission to Europe there was, the technological response in England was utterly novel and utterly formative of the modern world. The cant term would be game changer. So having wrestled with the two beasts, the two challenges to the story of the Industrial Revolution, and having hopefully returned Manchester to its former glory, I want to finish today by spending a few minutes talking about Manchester's 20th century decline, the decline that followed the rise. In the words of the OECD in their 2015 report on urbanisation, specialisation can yield returns if this part of the economy is performing well. However, it also reduces economic resilience and increases the risk of a severe downturn if the sector, in our case cotton, experiences an external shock or decline for other reasons. And unfortunately, that was to be the fate of Manchester in the 20th century. After the First World War, the deterioration of global economic conditions and the deglobalisation of the world economy, not helped by the Great Depression, cost many a cotton producer in Manchester. Exports of cotton declined from over 7,000 million yards a year in 1913 to less than a quarter of that amount by 1938. Unemployment soared, and it's here that we can find the roots of the North-South decline, the North-South divide. Whilst the Southeast entered the age of Art Deco, of the kind any viewer of Poirot can appreciate, with bright young things whizzing from one champagne party to another along the country lanes of southern England in their newfangled motor cars, the North fell into a grimness and bleakness that only Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier can truly make clear. Despite the optimism that came with a return to expansionary economic conditions after World War II, when international trade was being rebuilt and the British government began actively promoting British industry, including with phrases such as, "Britain's bread hangs by Lancashire thread." By the 1970s and 1980s, it was becoming clear that industry was not to be the future of the British economy. As cotton mills were closing down across the north of England, along with mines and steelworks, bringing mass unemployment, banking took off. Rather than reducing, the north-south divide now crystallised. As The Guardian recently noted in February this year, in response to a Joseph Rowntree Foundation study, 10 of the top 12 most declining UK cities at the present time are in the north of England. Since the financial crisis, the British government has been hoping to rebalance the British economy, from finance to manufacturing, and from the prosperous south of the economy to the ailing industrial north. The Northern Powerhouse, a scheme which aims to connect big northern cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield and Newcastle, is an essential part of this rebalancing project. None of these cities, Manchester included, are particularly sizable when compared with cities overseas, in places like India, China and the Middle East. Given that the greater is the size of a city, the higher seems to be its productivity and growth, it's vitally important that where cities are quite small in global comparison, but located quite close together, that they can work as one. According to the OECD, this is the problem that Europe faces nowadays. Europe needs to deal with the fact that in global comparison, its large cities are relatively small, which implies a specific need for cities to be well connected to each other. Here, and if it's successful, the Northern Powerhouse could act as a model for other parts of Europe. However, there are two caveats. Firstly, the benefits of the Northern Powerhouse risk being undermined by another recent policy change, devolving or decentralising powers to the local level. The OECD also finds in their 2015 report that in urban areas in which governance is fragmented, productivity suffers. By devolving more and more powers to individual cities, there's a real risk that cities will be unable to work together as successfully as they might otherwise do, scuppering the benefits that closer integration through schemes such as the Northern Powerhouse can bring. Now, the second caveat, whilst in comparison with London, cities like Manchester might seem relatively poor, the real poverty is to be found in the surrounding old cotton mill towns like Rochdale, Burnley, Bolton, and my hometown of Oldham, towns that were once part of Manchester's cotton network. But whilst the centre of Manchester has been undergoing gentrification and rejuvenation, many of these surrounding mill towns have been left to fester. So here are some of the results of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's ranking of relative decline at the city level, with a ranking of 1 being the worst performer, that's Rochdale, and a ranking of 74 being best. You can see London down towards the bottom, ranked 63. Interestingly, the city most ahead, Milton Keynes. That came as a surprise. Cambridge, my university city, 73. That was less of a surprise. So you can see here that whilst Manchester ranks 45th, that's over halfway towards being the top performer. Many of the close-by smaller cities perform very poorly indeed, and it's therefore vitally important that these areas are woven into the Northern Powerhouse network. Now, there are also other more distant cities at risk of being left behind, not just the Rochdales, the Burnleys, the Boltons, the Blackburn, but also Dundee. That's quite far from the Northern Powerhouse project. Nottingham is another, and Glasgow as well, which ranks 16th of the 74th cities in terms of relative decline. So compared with many of these other cities, Manchester has in fact been doing a great job of reinventing itself in the post-cotton age. We've already mentioned the fashion industry earlier on in the lecture, an outgrowth of Manchester's cotton past. But not only has the Manchester of the 20th and 21st centuries become known in the fashion world, it's also a hub of creativity more generally. And here, Manchester often does best when it pulls together the past and the present, harnessing the energy of the social discontent associated with economic decline in a positive direction, as it's done in the cases of filmmaking, TV, music, with the great bands such as Take That and Oasis, and art. By being home not only to the entrepreneurs of the industrial age, but also to more arty types, Manchester is in a position to grow from strength to strength in the years ahead. And in fact, it's precisely these two types of figures, the artist and the entrepreneur, that a study has shown to be most fundamental to a city's success. So this study draws on 1.2 million people from 3000 BC to the present, covering 2,000 cities in 30 countries. And the authors find that it's the entrepreneur and the artist, not the politician, not the religious figure, and not the military men that most contribute to successful city growth. So with this in mind, Manchester has the potential to become a modern-day Venice, combining arts and commerce neatly alongside. And looking ahead, economists would therefore do well to spend as much time with artists and creative types as they do with the more standard business types. And in their policy of rebalancing the economy, rather than seeking to simply go backwards in time to reinvent the old industrial age, policymakers need to recognise and embrace what the arts can do for an economy. And here I'm pleased to say that Legatum Institute has an event coming up next month that will feed into that. So, in conclusion, by the way, the Venice of the North, according to the OECD, cities are the drivers of long-run growth. Now, whilst they have a long heritage in the parts of the world outside of Europe, it was in Europe where urbanisation first reached modern-day heights, with British cities like Manchester leading the way. These cities successfully managed to harness the powers of the market and channel the state in a more productive direction than it had been in the past. In the new age, it is, however, outside of the West where urbanisation is once again steaming ahead. And in the process, there's a lot to be learned from the experience of a city like Manchester, a city that shows the best and the worst of what capitalism has to offer. And not only does the city have lessons for cities developing in countries such as India and China, it also has lessons for the capital, London, here in the UK. Specialisation, whether in cotton or in banking, can bring expansionary economic conditions for a lengthy period of time, but it can also leave a city vulnerable. Whilst London is thriving today, just as Manchester was doing in the Victorian age, it should not take its success for granted. However, like Manchester, by balancing business with the arts, the city can make itself more resilient. And as I say, for that reason, I'm pleased that Julia Peyton-Jones, the former director of the Serpentine Gallery, will be coming to speak to us here at the Legatum Institute next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to stand here before the Venice of the North and to visualize.